Live from the New Scientist Labs, it's Janine Young with Wammo on Kiwi.
With the latest in new science from the New Scientist Laboratories, Melbourne City, Janine Young. Good morning, Janine.
Good morning, Wammo.
Now, we've got a few stories to get through, so we'll crack straight on into it. The first one here about green pets or not so green pets, as the case may be. This is an interesting study.
I think a lot of people won't realise that having a pet is actually a bit of an extravagance. Pets tend to have a huge carbon footprint, particularly because of the amount of meat that they eat. Dogs and cats are, well, by history, meat eaters.
Yes.
And so it's been calculated, for example, that a medium-sized dog, if they eat 300 grams of dried food a day, about a third of that is going to be meat.
Mm-hmm. And
that was going to take 450 grams of fresh meat to take it down to that dry weight.
Really?
And that adds up to 164 kilograms of meat a year.
Wow.
And 95 kilograms of cereals. And when you think about the footprint required to generate that, a kilogram of chicken, it's a 43.3 square metres of land to just 1 kilogram of chicken, and it's more for beef and lamb. Ultimately, a dog gets a footprint, a large dog this is, of 0.84 hectares. Now, when you compare that to an SUV, a four-wheel drive, say a Land Cruiser, that comes up to 0.41 hectares, including all the materials and the fuel and all that made to build it. It's still about half that of a large dog.
That is astounding.
It's scary, isn't it? And then when you think about cats, they eat a bit as well.
Yeah.
But they also tend to eat wildlife. If they're out at night, because they're nocturnal, they will stalk birds and fish and other small animals. And they reckon...
Don't I know it, by the way? Don't I know it?
Well, yeah, the whole idea is you're meant to keep your cats in at night to try and bring some of that toll down.
Yeah.
But there's also issues with the fact that feces is getting into water supplies. Along the California coast, they've actually found that sea otters are dying from a brain disease caught from Toxoplasma gondii, which comes out of cat feces.
No.
Because people are flushing cat litter down the toilet instead of disposing of it properly. So all this is getting into estuaries and rivers, and it's also affecting dolphins and whales. So having a pet is actually a bit of an extravagance.
Yeah. Did this article cover budgies and guinea pigs, or just the bigger animals? It
did mainly talk about the bigger animals, but even a goldfish has a footprint of 0.0003 hectares, which is 3.4 square metres of land to sustain it. So not even that is without any kind of footprint. And a hamster comes in at 0.014, and if you buy two, you might as well have bought a plasma TV.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. But one thing you can say, right, your dog isn't driving the Land Cruiser, you know? So, I mean, okay, your dog, it's got this certain carbon footprint, but it's not going to go out. So it's not like a human being that's going to go and cause more environmental chaos than what it does in just eating.
Yeah, look, dogs also tend to have an effect about where you walk them. If you are in an area that has a whole bunch of birds, they've actually found that the bird life in areas where dogs are walked, even when they're on a lead, can be 35% less.
Really?
And there can be 41% fewer birds overall. Because, dogs run around and they bark and they're big and they tend to scare things around them.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot of good news in this one. They're saying that if you do want to have a pet, then they're suggesting perhaps a hen, because hens partly compensate for the eco-footprint by providing eggs. And apparently rabbits aren't bad if you're prepared to eat them.
Because cats don't give anything back, just coveted love.
Precisely, and I'm a cat person, so I understand.
Likewise, yeah. Hey, let's move on to this next one. Your bullying boss really is an idiot.
Yes, I'm sure many people will just go, yes, I knew it, we finally have proof.
Yeah.
Turns out new research is showing that leaders who feel incompetent lash out at others, and they're doing this to kind of temper down their own inferiority. I think most people realise that when you're not feeling that great, you have defence mechanisms. You cope the best way you can. But a lot of people who have really high-powered jobs want to feel as though they're capable of doing it. They want to feel powerful. They're actually finding that the most aggressive bosses had the highest jobs, and they actually had a real chip on their shoulder. if they didn't feel competent, they actually dealt, in this experiment anyway, really harsh punishments to other people because they were compensating for their own feelings of inadequacy.
So basically, is it so are you talking about personalities who wouldn't naturally be in positions of power, but they are in positions of power, and so therefore they've got to compensate for that?
I don't know if it's actually the personality types wouldn't necessarily otherwise be there. They asked 90 men and women who had jobs of any description to complete questionnaires about the sorts of aggressive tendencies they had and their perceived competence. And they found that the most aggressive of those tended to have the high-power jobs. So they weren't necessarily angling for the people who were the highest end to start with. They found through this process that those who had the highest power tended to also be the most aggressive.
Okay.
So they're actually finding that if you actually bruise some of these people's egos, that's when they'll lash out, implying that they can't do their job is perhaps the worst thing you can do.
Yeah.
And they're suggesting that even though, flattering these people by saying, oh, you're actually a good leader and, you're actually trying to do a good job here, does actually bring down some of their aggression. And it might explain why some of these people surround themselves with yes men.
Right, exactly. And here's the term kissing, you know what?
Yes. They're saying perhaps, easing leaders into new positions of power or telling them that it's natural to feel daunted might be a way to help future outbursts. And it's ultimately about their egos.
Mm-hmm. All right, finally, meet the future woman. What are the future women going to look like, Janine?
As a woman of 5'5", I'm delighted by this one because the woman of the future, they reckon, is going to be slightly shorter. She's going to be slightly plumper. Not too happy about that one, but there we go. They're going to have healthier hearts and longer reproductive cycles.
Why is that?
Well, they're finding at the moment that by looking at the Framingham Heart Study, which is a study in Massachusetts, in the United States, they've been working on this since 1948. They've been following 14,000 residents, and they looked at more than 2,000 women who'd passed menopause. They looked at their height, their weight, their blood pressure, cholesterol, all the sorts of things, and they found that the shorter, heavier women tended to have more children than taller, lighter ones. I affectionately call them stick insects. Women with lower blood pressure and lower cholesterol also had more children, and so did women, not surprisingly really, who had their child at an earlier age and those who hit menopause later.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that they're passing these traits on to their daughters. So their daughters are also having more children, and they believe, considering they've controlled for a whole bunch of cultural and other social factors, that this is natural selection at work. This is genetics. And people have thought for a long time that humans had stopped evolving. We didn't have pressures on us now that mean that we were going to be changing the way genetically we worked. And this is some early proof that that's in fact wrong, and we do in fact have selection going on.
So that those are physical attributes. That they didn't look into mental attributes at all, did they?
They were the ones that they were controlling for. They
Right.
were looking for genetic type issues, because when you start getting into mental attributes, it gets really, really complicated, because it's never going to be just one gene. It's never going to be caused by just one thing. So they've controlled those out to try and look at the genetic factors to see whether or not that was what was driving this process, or whether perhaps, there might have been something else. And they're finding that these genetic changes are being passed on. And they reckon that if these trends continue for 10 generations, the average woman in 2,409, so that's still a long way away, but she'll be 2 centimetres shorter and a kilogram heavier than she is today. She'll bear her first child at 5 months earlier and enter menopause 10 months later. They're fairly substantial changes.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'd like to see that study sort of combined with other studies about who's breeding. Say, United States as an example, where there's this fear amongst, I guess, the academic elite, I suppose, that it's the rednecks and caravan dwellers who are breeding, in America, as opposed to the educated class, I suppose you could say, who are focusing on career and not focusing on breeding at all. And so there you having this lopsided kind of society, perhaps where the less intelligent I suppose is one way of putting it. But that's an American example.
Well, I think you see the same thing in a lot of different societies. Certainly here in Australia, we have the, as they call them, bogans down south, and they're Westies if they're up in Sydney. It tends to be that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds do tend to have more children. If the more educated you are, the higher your job is, the more you're concentrated on that, the less children you have.
But I guess that's separate to this, which is looking at specifically physical attributes.
Exactly. They're looking at 14,000 residents in one town since 1948. So I don't know the distribution or the socioeconomic distribution across that town.
Yeah.
So obviously, that would be important. But I think they're extrapolating. They have to extrapolate. There's only so much you can do here.
Exactly.
But in terms of the social factors, they ruled those out completely because I gather that got just a little bit too hard.
Thanks, Janine.